Hi, this is Deepak Shenoy on the Capitalmind show at TheBigScope. We'll talk a little bit more today about a lot of things related to finance, about markets, about stocks, and about technology. So, going forward, Tarat is going to ask me a few questions. I'm going to take you through a few answers. And if you have any questions or answers, tweet or message us. And let's take it forward. Tarat, I think there's a problem with the assumption that, if this government doesn't continue, a lot of the policies that they've implemented will kind of fall off the wayside. A lot of the policies that they've carried forward are actually the previous government's policies, right? So it's not, Aadhaar was not their invention. They absorbed and kind of embraced it. I think a sort of policy of continuance is going to be kind of more or less expected. A few things that might reverse perhaps is a few aspects of what they probably pushed a little too hard on. Some of it could be the beef bans in various states of the country that might change if the policies change. But if you look at a continuance of this government, we'll look at a lot of small things that start taking impact. You've got more road building happening. These things take about 8 to 10 years before a policy like that actually starts to take shape. You've got ship yards getting refined, and I know not refined, reformed actually. So you get reforms that need to continue over 10 years that will actually see some kind of an impact. Whether it is a process of using more inland shipping routes, whether it is a process of creating more logistic capabilities, letting the GST's impact flow through. I think a lot of those things will continue. What might actually embolden the government more if this gets a complete majority and therefore is able to push through more policies than it has been able to in the recent past. Recent past again being a problem with the Rajya Sabha more than the Lok Sabha. If it weren't to get a majority, then you would believe that everybody's going to try and negotiate for their own part of the turf. So that will downgrade a little bit of the reform process. Having said that, there's not been much of a reform process in the recent past. The sales of public sector enterprises have really not happened. There's just one that's being talked about so far. Many of them have just been listed, but most of that happens to get owned by LIC all over again, which is not really disinvestment. So in a certain way, I think the policies have to really happen in order for them to continue, and hopefully if the government continues, whichever government comes, it will be a continuance of reform or an increase in reform and lesser government rather than more government, which we have been seeing in the recent past. Well, at this point, it doesn't seem like there is any favorites. If you look at what the government has been doing, but largely they've been helping a lot of infrastructure companies who have otherwise been sidelined because the government tends to pay them either a lot late or refutes their payments, sends them to arbitration, takes them to Supreme Court and different courts. So it's almost like the infrastructure company is your enemy, and this government has actually tried to make them their friends. So hopefully that will continue, and going forward, the idea of infrastructure being superior will continue. The problem now is that once you made friends with a certain type of infrastructure company, sets of infrastructure company, for instance, solar power. If it's solar power is your friend, is thermal power your enemy, and thermal power is still the biggest source of power generation in the country. Is wind power no longer a friend? Is hydropower not as useful as it used to be? So those are questions we don't have answers for. I think over the next few years we're going to see whether that the solar power overpowering a lot of the other power producers is going to be an interesting battle to see, and how the government takes its stance there. Well, I think to a certain extent we've had a lot of these bank frauds where the government has clamped down a lot in terms of saying, listen, we'll seize your assets, we'll put Interpol notices on you, we will, this is all without due process so far, right? So it's like, you've accused Nirav Modi of X, but you haven't yet convicted him, and there's a lookout notice and so on. So there is a tremendous amount of work that has gone in actually almost proactively to try and bring him back, bring him to trial, And hopefully over the next few years we're going to see a lot more of that. So a lot of the friends of government who would easily default and get away with, that has gone away. And to a certain extent, the Bankruptcy Code itself, which has been introduced as of like 2 years ago, has changed the mentality of a lot of industrialists whose idea was that, listen, I'm a big industrialist, so what if I default? I'm going to go back and I'm going to say I'll buy back my own company from you banks for a much lower rate. You guys have to write off your debt. That's no longer being allowed to happen. The government is actually taking a serious stance against that. This has caused a little bit of consternation in those very circles. It's a little bit of a old boys cliched kind of circle where people, all of them are related. This guy's brother-in-law is married to that guy's sister and so on. So those are the guys who tend to get affected the most because they can't live their whole lives quite as easily anymore. But I don't know if it's the BJP government or it's just the time, because this is the time when people are aware of these things and they won't let that happen regardless of which government it is. The previous government was possibly not as welcoming to people's views on these matters. This government seems to have. So that part of the policy, the losers part of this policy, will be the guys who were traditionally looking at quick fixes, probably looting taxpayers in certain ways. Those are going to go away, and I think that's going to be regardless of which government comes in, because people are just more aware now. The losers, of course, also will be certain sectors where the government has actually clamped down on a few things, like the beef ban has affected the leather industry. Leather was one of India's largest exports. How does this pan out in the longer term? Because if you have a ban on beef, you're going to have a ban on people, effectively a ban on people raising cows, because you bought a cow with a value that it would pay a certain price for it, it would give milk for a certain number of years, and then you'd get rid of that cow after the milk years, saying, somebody else take it from there. There would be the leather industry that took care of it, the beef industry that took care of it. That part of it's not happening. So there's a big part of that industry that's going to get wiped out. And the impact is not felt right now. It's in the effective downstream impact of it will appear after a year or so, because it's a very, very big industry. And supply imbalances are going to happen after 3 or 4 years. People aren't going to rear cows as much as they like to. And therefore, you're going to have issues with either milk supply or with leather supply or with, the industries are revolving around them going bust. That's the end of today's show, folks. This is Deepak Shenoy. I meet you next week from the Capitalmind tables. This is thank you, goodbye, and keep watching The Big Scope and the Capitalmind show here.